Ryan Olkey, what's up, buddy?
Hey, good to see you, man.
Great to see you, man.
We're here. We continue in existence.
We persist.
We persist.
we are some persistent sons of bitches, let me tell you that.
We are here. Yep.
Well, so yeah, we are here. And we are here basically to continue a conversation that we started over the last month or two, which I've been sort of jokingly calling the Humpty Dumpty conversation. How do we start putting Humpty Dumpty back together again? And of course, sort of the joke in that is you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? I mean, all the king's horses and all the king's men have tried. And basically your only option is to find a new damn egg.
Yeah, it seems like where we're at in a lot of ways. Yep. Not just put the same thing back together, but we're trying to. There's been a deconstruction of what used to be, and trying to find out what's coming next.
Yep. Build back better, as they say. God, what a terrible slogan.
It's got 3 B's in it.
It's got some
alliteration.
Alliteration, yeah. But it seems like a focused, grouped version of Make America Great Again,
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, we've long talked about their messaging.
Yes, we have. And we're not going to talk about today, but we're going to talk about something sort of related.
Yeah.
Which is this massive social crisis that we are currently undergoing around our issues of trust. Mm-hmm. And man, is this such an important issue. And, this is the sorts of problems that I think integral minds really like to key in on are what we call wicked problems. And, just to sort of refresh our audience, the definition of a wicked problem is basically a problem that is so complex and so multivalent, has so many different moving parts that you can find factors in all 4 quadrants. And in fact, once you change one of those factors in any of those 4 quadrants, it then changes the other factors in all the other quadrants. All of these things hang together. And all of these sort of, quadratic factors are producing feedback loops with each other. They're co-creating the conditions for each other. And so it is a massively complex problem that minimally requires an integral understanding and really an integral granularity in order to fully wrap our minds around and come up with effective solutions, interventions, etc. And when it comes to these wicked problems, I mean, we're talking about things like climate change. We're talking about things like social fragmentation. And here we're talking about the collapse of social trust, which seems to be an issue that's not just affecting America. I mean, it's definitely really affecting America, but we're seeing this all across the world. There are global indexes that track this stuff, and they've been seeing a constant decline of trust in each other, in our society, in our governing institutions, in our media institutions. I would even go so far as to say in ourselves, in our relationship with God or evolution or sort of whatever big, whatever word you have for this ongoing unfolding. Trust is definitely sort of in tatters these days. And I'm hoping we can have a generative conversation that can track some of these issues, take a look at some of the main challenges that we're seeing in each of these quadrants, and maybe even come up with a few, kind of easy methods of self-care and methods of practice, trust building practice, that we can share with each other and with our audience. What do you think about that?
I love it. Yeah. Trust is just taking a little note here for later. Trust is so interesting. It's definitely a fascinating topic. And actually, when I first started teaching, I like to use what's already been created and tested over time, but I also like to take a step back and what do I know really? Let me write down just what I think I know maybe. And I kind of mapped out a progression of waking up, I would say a little bit is more in the waking up category. And for me, I end up putting in the final stage trust, which has a little bit of mystery to it. And even it's a topic that's so fascinating to me, but if you go Google trust, there's one Wikipedia page on there, and there are social theories and a little philosophy on there, but it's not huge. You know, like if you look up meaning, for example, another word that's quite big and quite relevant right now, used very much colloquially, you find tons of pages and philosophical traditions and psychological traditions. But it's really interesting to me that trust doesn't have as much, which to me would indicate that, yeah, there's going to be some ambiguity around it. Like even when we explore it, which is even more challenging a little bit in a time where we're feeling a lack of trust. So it's just sort of a starting point of just like, this is interesting to note. What the hell do we mean by trust when we say that word? And what does it feel like to not have trust? And of course, a model like Integral allows us to find different ways in which we might speak of trust or experience trust, which is really useful. So I'm excited to do that today.
Yep. Well, and of course, Ken Wilber has written, fairly extensively, not necessarily on trust, but on the principles of truth. Yes. And on the principles of validity claims. Right. You know, he talks about how truth does not exist in a vacuum. Truth is dependent. Upper right quadrant falsifiable truth is dependent on upper left quadrant truthfulness. Right. And truthfulness implicitly means trust. How much trust do you have that this source, this person, this organization, what have you, is telling you the truth? What is their track record of truth telling? Is it, if it's a good track record, then you're going to place more trust in them, and therefore you're going to regard them as more truthful. If they have been caught and exposed in lies and corruption, etc., then you should probably take a more cautious eye to those sorts of sources. So Ken has talked about how trust fits into this overall fabric of truth finding, which I think is a pretty good starting place. But I think ultimately, when we look at what is the function of trust in a society, to me, I often like using these kinds of metaphors because they're prominent for me, but trust is something like an immune system for a society at large. And it prevents, certain kinds of regression, certain kinds of just political manipulation, all of that sort of fills in the space where trust should be. So trust is paramount for any functional society, especially a functional democracy. And what we've been seeing over the last month post-election is a constant attack on trust. We actually have a lame duck president right now who is fomenting distrust among as many people as he possibly can in the institutions that support democracy as we know it. And I made a joke a couple episodes ago that democracy is kind of like one of those ancient gods. It's like Zeus. It's only as real as you believe in it. And as soon as enough people, a plurality of people, stop believing, stop trusting, then democracy has no legitimacy. Right. And then once you start delegitimizing democracies, then you have a real, fairly terrifying possibility of a backslide to more authoritarian forms of governance.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So a few things kind of maybe a little random, but connected. So I've been diving into work by a guy named David Chapman. I don't know if you know him, but his work, he has a website, which is really an ongoing book that he just put into a website called Meaningness. And actually, you can go look this up later, but he postulates that he's actually the character in Kin's Boomeritis book. And
I did read that. Yep.
Yeah, he's right. So, but he's super interesting.
Can I just say really quick before we get into that?
Yeah.
When I first read Boomeritis, I thought the same thing, which was what exactly told me that I had Boomeritis.
No, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah. Well, he's really great. And he talks about stances we take towards reality, and actually a complete stance very much feels in line with a lot of, what Kin says about taking a more complete stance. But some of the partial stances that he highlights is eternalism and nihilism, which takes different forms. It's not just in the religious context. But he makes note that it seems like that we as humans are not disposed to be so much in nihilism. Like we oscillate between these more likely than anything else. But if we're going to be like really in one camp or the other, it's more likely it will be in the camp of eternalism, because nihilism just seems like evolutionary speaking. It doesn't serve us so much to hang out in nihilism. And so trust relates this to here, because, for example, with eternalism, we have confidence and trust that there is meaning to life, that there is an answer, that there is a plan, whether that plan's religious or whether that plan is rational and scientific. And that gives us confidence. And that's probably why it's an evolutionary function to lean that way, is because it's like, we got to, if we can't trust in literally anything, we can't, what do we do? And like those kinds of states of deep distrust within ourselves can manifest like depression, for example.
Yeah.
Like it becomes hard to do anything. So like when somebody's somebody or people are trying to sow distrust, it puts us in a real nihilistic state of being, which isn't really sustainable. Even if we're going to say eternalism and nihilism are incomplete stances, we still got to be functional in the world. We still have to deal with reality. And I know many of us felt like we're not dealing with reality super well this year. So that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, like, when we look up the word trust, I always like looking up words in the dictionary just to orient myself, especially with words that are super common. So we can have trust in like facts, for example, like, is this a bottle or not a bottle? I trust this is a bottle. I'm not hallucinating, right? So there's some things that's like really concrete when we say trust. And we have a lot of problems with that right now. They would trust in facts, like all the time news. It's like you can go on the news and say, I'm holding a bottle, like fake news, there's no bottle. And you're like, what's going on? And like, that's maddening. Then we can look at trust, like in the quadrants, like, do I trust my own experience? You know what I mean? So this is like, we talk about in with emotions, and especially like with gaslighting, things like that. Can I trust my own experience? Like I feel angry now. I trust that my anger is valid, or I feel happy. Do I trust you? That's the lower left quadrant. Or do I trust us? What's going on here? Do I trust it? What I'm seeing out there? Do I trust their systems? So I think just even teasing out a little bit, starting with a more broad point, can be helpful here in this conversation of like, what do we mean by trust? Which kind of trust? And then which quadrants are we talking about trust? And of course, like you mentioned earlier, all this is happening at once, and there's a lot of distrust all over the place, which makes this a compounding sort of meta crisis kind of situation around meaning and trust.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's good news and bad news. And I think that the numbers actually bear out your point against this, in terms of this rejection of nihilism. Because as it turns out, the majority of the population, in fact, the vast majority of the population, is optimistic when it comes to our potential for rebuilding and restoring trust. I see this as tremendously good news. So even though we're all sort of sitting in this cynicism, there's some part of us that recognizes that there's something better on the other shore, right? There's some part of us that recognizes there's some place to go from here. And I think that's tremendously encouraging. I want to share real quick. I figure as we start kind of touring through these, different factors in all the four quadrants, let's start in the lower right quadrant. So I have this collection of stats from Pew Research, which you listening can decide whether or not you trust Pew Research or if you trust polling as a whole. I mean, this is just an example of one of sort of the areas where we might be coming into this conversation with some distrust. But let's just take it in good faith and sort of see how it feels. So we have this, did that show up? So we have this collection of basically polling data, where people were asked, first they were asked, basically, do you think this can get better? Do you think it's possible to restore trust? And for those who think trust in the federal government, we're talking about the federal government specifically here, which I think is a good place to start because it's probably one of the most difficult areas to rebuild trust, particularly in the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate world. I mean, the last 50 years has seen this constant sort of erosion of trust in government as soon as sort of those levels of corruption were brought to light. And ever since, we've been looking for, other sort of flags, other red flags that indicate equivalent levels of corruption. And a lot of people think they see it all the time in our government. But the good news is 84% of adults think it's possible to improve Americans' confidence in the federal government. And then they give a whole list of things when asked, this is what people think would help. Now, I think it's important when we look at a list like this to not, it's not sort of a list of priorities. It's just a list of what has the potential to be selected for by culture at large when and if we start implementing some solutions here. So, 23% of people believe that this begins, the most important priority here is reforming our political systems. And they include things like practicing more transparency, less secrecy. It's kind of hard to kind of nail down what exactly each of these means, but you I think can recognize the spirit of what that means. Enacting term limits. That's an example of something that I think would actually decrease trust in the long term, and we can have a very long conversation about it, but it shows, again, the type of solutions that people are thinking about and that can get selected for. Curtailing the role of money in politics. I was surprised that wasn't higher on the list. Conducting fair elections, fixing the Constitution. So all of these roll up into this group of 23% of trusting Americans believe that this is sort of the best way forward. And then there's, various policies that can be fixed, tax and budget issues, economic problems.
It's interesting. One, that, it is a high number, which would, indicate like the kind of just natural orientation, like in spite of ourselves kind of thing. Like we're going to lean towards like, it's got to be some hope. There's got to be possibility. You know what I mean? We're going to ultimately land there a lot of times. But also at the same time, like even the response of 23% is not very high in terms of identifying what would be helpful, to improve confidence. And the numbers are really low. So if I was going to draw a super simple conclusion, it's like, definitely we can improve. And I have no effing idea how to do it.
Right.
That would be the conclusion here, which is really fascinating. And that, down here it says refuse, don't know, 33%. So again, we have to read into this a little bit, and we always take these things with a grain of salt, but that would make sense to me, that would be an honest response of a lot of people. It's just like, I feel like we can do better than this and we can improve confidence, and got no clue how to do that, primarily because everything we've been trying hasn't been working. And like, that's even when we're talking about politically speaking, a lot of people just got to feel that because nothing's really been done. If we really look at it, there's hardly been anything been done in many, many years. So
right.
It's an interesting place.
Right. Well, and notice too, that all of these interventions are lower right quadrant interventions.
Yeah. Which is
all lower right prescriptions.
Right. So that's a bias here, that this were the kind of things, there wasn't any suggestions of, like, for example, how do we have conversations?
That's right.
Exactly. Like a la Diane Hamilton's work,
Yep. Well, and I thought, the other reason why you can't look at this as a list of priority, as a ranked list of priorities, because, for example, 3% of people say curtailing the role of money in politics. 7% of people say just getting rid of Trump. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's sort of get a better, more clear sense of our priorities here and what would actually make an impact, because as many of us say, Trump is not a cause of the sickness. He's a symptom of a social sickness, if anything else, if that's what you believe. I know there's a lot of people watching right now who are pro-Trump, and we'll make space for that too, even while telling you why you're wrong. So I thought that this was an interesting place to start, because I found it encouraging that so many Americans not only have a vague sense that this can get better, but they actually have their own kind of roadmap. And, I think that there's some general kind of crowdsourced wisdom that comes out of that. So that gives me hope.
Yeah. Something else related to this. I was just reading out of Religion Tomorrow, because today in Integral Dharma Training, we're going to do a little bit of we focus. And Ken has a little great small chapter in the back of this book as kind of one of his, what does he call it? Like extra bits, of the model, like typology and things like that. And he has some really great notes in there, but he makes it, of course, always the biggest thing that I know Ken says about the we is like, don't get confused. Like there's some sort of like central monad or central controlling consciousness that is like we're a part of, which can be a mistake sometimes of like postmodern green. Like there are individuals who are participating. So what he says, there's not a dominant like monad, there's a dominant mode of discourse and resonance. That's right. But the way he details that out, I think is really interesting there, of like, how do people orient around all the values, beliefs, and behaviors to form a we? And like in each, he identifies, for example, at a church, traditional church, you might have what he calls the layering of a cake. And it's like most of the people are going to be in the layer of mythic kind of membership. You're going to have some that are magical, mythical, smaller layer of that. And you might have a smaller layer of people that might be in the rational green, in a church, but you have those layers there. And even he gives an example between science, a scientist who works in science but goes to a mythical kind of church, that those kind of areas are separated.
Yeah, they get compartmentalized.
But I bring this up because, trust, from one perspective, we're going to look like trust is established via a combination of all these things of like, do we agree on values and behaviors? And this is how we orient. So it's like, this is how we orient, how we make trust, how we stay oriented to trust is set by these, social containers that we're a part of, which we're a part of many, many different we's, small and macro. And it seems, I'm just like, this is kind of me thinking in real time about this. I found it really fascinating to read that part from Ken and think about this conversation. It's like, how many social containers have been sort of disrupted, like across the spectrum, in recent times? Like if you look at evangelicals, there's been a sense of, like, there's videos of them talking, being like, it's very confused because it's like, well, clearly they're going to support Trump, but then so many of his behaviors are out of line with what would normally be considered trustworthy. Yep. In there. And even there's videos acknowledging like where evangelical leaders are like having at a conference, I forget who did this, maybe Vice, but evangelical conference that meets every year. And there's a clear confusion about like, what do we do about this? Like, it's not the same old, even in that contained context, regardless of whether I'm part of that context or not. I don't know. I see that happen. A lot of different we's are being shifted and transformed and disrupted. And Ken makes the point that with the evolution of every I, there will be necessarily evolving we's. And so there's a question here: are we evolving new we's, and is that necessary to kind of shake out in order to have like trust? And are we kind of in the midst of like this awkward, difficult transition period in developmentally speaking, which is totally a different thing that's not going to be listed on one of those Pew Research. Right. Like, should we emphasize developmental? But one last thing, Ken acknowledges in there too, which I was happy to see that, because I keep saying this for myself, that like there's no real clear answer to how we practice development. Like, there's a lot of ideas about it, there's a lot of descriptions of it, but like there's not that many great solutions on like how do we emphasize that. So development is part of this whole trust conversation.
Absolutely. No, and it's a really important point, particularly around sort of the social containers that all of this is unfolding within. And when we're taking when we're actually emphasizing a lower right quadrant look into this, I mean, what we're really doing is sort of taking a somewhat Marxist kind of view, where we're saying, here are sort of the social containers, here's the shape of the social container, and we're noticing how our upper left consciousness and our lower left culture is sort of like a gas that expands to fill whatever container it finds itself in. And in this case, our social containers are shaped in a very particular way that have very particular consequences for the rest of us in all other quadrants. The American Psychological Association, for example, they point to the decrease. I would frame this as the rise of neoliberalism and the emphasis on the public sphere and the under emphasis on the private sphere. And as a result of that, a lot of our sort of communal rituals, things like going to church or gossiping with your neighbors or having a bowling league or, things like this, have been increasingly replaced with individual activities that keep us isolated from each other. So these days we are exposed to more people than we've ever been exposed to in our lives. And yet we know fewer people than we've ever known in our lives. And within that social container, it's, not too difficult to see how so much of this has atrophied.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think also, Ryan, some of the other lower right things that we want to take into consideration is, I've just been doing a lot of thinking about how much economic incentive there is for driving and manufacturing mistrust versus the incentives, the short-term incentives for generating trust. Yeah. And there's far more incentives to create distrust than there are to create trust in the short term. However, weirdly, in the long term, the exact opposite is true. Societies that have high levels of trust end up getting higher levels of, for example, financial investment, right? And then you get more social mobility, GDP growth. I mean, these are all lower right quadrant factors, but they're important factors to look at, because if your basic deficiency needs are not being met, that's keeping you in a constant state of fear and anxiety and therefore mistrust. Someone's out to get you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We brought it up before in different contexts, and this is well known at this point, and which is a good news to me. Like we've plenty of documentaries and news stories of just about how, for example, social media platforms have had impacts on us just individually, as society, in politics, things like that. And clearly, the developers and designers coming out and saying like 100%, our data shows that if we emphasize fear and distrust and these kinds of things, we get more engagement and clicks, which leads to whatever advertising dollars or et cetera. That's what they care about. And so like, and it seems like we're trying, or at least we're positioned to try to fix that or reclaim it a little bit. There's a question like, what do we do with it? Like, for example, like Facebook is just such a huge part. We're all on it, and we're all on Twitter. It's just like, well, what are we going to do? But it's important to know that if we're going to explore trust and know just like, how is this impacting me? Can I feel into this and be honest? Like, how does it impact me to engage in these platforms in the variety of ways? This is not say like, get rid of the platform, but notice how I engage with it, because it can erode my own trust. It can exhaust my ability to trust and it's my fault in the sense of taking responsibility for what I do, but it's also kind of like, well, we're part of these systems we didn't get asked about how they should be created. It'll be like, I need water, and I didn't know that they were slipping, drugs in the water until a little later. But we didn't ask either in a certain way.
Yep.
And some of the hope that I have too, like we've always seen this with different things in kind of the lower right quadrant, like especially like, for example, advertising. Like if you look, it's interesting. I watched a video the other day, a little, fun YouTube video, like what happened to jingles? And they analyzed kind of the history of jingles. Like when we were kids, there were jingles, and we still know them to this day. Like they're in our brains, but they're not really that many jingles anymore. And they just don't work on it. So there's some things that over time don't work on us. Like we know, looking back, how manipulative the commercials were when we were growing up, and like they preyed upon different things in us. But after a while, we're like, this is bullshit. You know what I mean? And now you can't throw one of those super just like dopey, like we're going to take you for your money. Like you have to work harder to trick us. You can still get us, but you have to work a little harder and a little differently, more nuanced. So I don't know, maybe we'll find our way out of being hooked into some of these manipulative mechanisms that erode trust, but who knows? Probably just.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of sort of the short-term gain around all this is, you sow distrust so that more people will trust you. You tell people like, no, all those people are lying to you. I'm the only one telling you how it is. So, it's a surreptitious sort of shell game,
right.
Where you're basically trying to, dislodge people's trust in, for example, this thing called shared reality. You have a number of people who are trying to dislodge as many people from that sense of shared reality as possible. And that, yes, shared reality is flawed, right? Sometimes the institutions we trust the most get it wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And it's their responsibility to sort of atone for that and work to rebuild trust again. And that's something I'd like to see much more of from our media institutions. I want media institutions to basically start educating people on journalistic practices. Like, here's how a story is written. Here's how stories are verified. Here's sort of the different levels of sourcing that we use. Here are the main validity claims that are important to journalism. It's like we need a re-education in critical thinking when it comes to consuming our media.
Very much. It takes it. Yeah. I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, we're dealing with new challenges. So like the part, like, it's easy to beat ourselves up around like, where do we go wrong? Like the old throwing the rocks at the Google bus kind of thing, where it's just like, I always remember like, listen, we were all part of the train, and now we're upset later. Like we didn't know what was going on or something. But, also these are new challenges. Like this is a new thing in humanity in the last, couple decades, to like be like connected real time to billion other people and have more information than ever existed in the history of humanity at a fingertip. It's a different thing, and which is really interesting why like certain practices that have been cultivated, for example, in spiritual traditions or like an integral life practice, are now like really, really practical. They're not just like interesting and cool. What can I experience? It's like, yeah, like maybe we need some of these practices in order to be able to navigate these more complex waters that we live in. And I tend to think that now. Do you think about things like virtual reality, for example, as that keeps coming up more and more? It's like, how are people not going to have some baseline of meditative capacity to be able to be in that realm? I mean, like without going insane, right? It's just
without fully dissociating.
Yeah, like there's some things that it's like, oh, now it's required. Like it doesn't mean like, oh, we should shun away from these new realities. It's just like we got to learn how to navigate them differently, And like you said, critical thinking, part of it is, has the critical thinking eroded and from where it used to be? I think that's true. Like we've kind of had a step regression back, but then also we just have new challenges that require new levels of critical thinking that demand more of us,
I loved the point you made about how, these sorts of integral conversations just a few years ago, they were like nice to haves. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Let's sit here and be kind of idealistic and like, oh, wouldn't it be great if?
For sure, me in the past, that was definitely true. Yeah,
yep.
A long time.
And now I think reality has finally sort of met integral face to face, right? Yep. And these are no longer nice to haves. These are like, holy shit, these are basic requirements if I'm going to survive this era.
And I like it because it's humbling, and I think actually it makes the process better. I think when we practice from an idealistic standpoint, yeah, great, good things can happen, but it's so easy for it to go awry because we're being motivated mainly by our idealism. But here it's just like, no, it matters. So like I want to do this the best I can. I'm paying attention. So I think Integral is positioned well to have these conversations around trust. Yeah. What else? I have some other things to throw out there around practice too.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get to practice because I've got a whole little section set for left stuff, and I think that's in lower left. I mean, that's where we want to really get into this. So I figured let's finish up the exteriors. Let's shift to the upper right.
What else we got to cover on this?
Well, let's look at the upper right because another thing that I find myself thinking about is basically like physiological self-care. And how our physiological self-care actually, again, creates these resonance patterns with all of these other factors and all of the other quadrants. For example, I think that integral sort of comes with this implicit prioritization of learning how to recognize and make into object these interior states, emotional states, spiritual states, and what have you, right? That's really, that's foundational to, as a basic level of like meta awareness that comes with integral consciousness that allows you to do that. But then there's another beat, which I think is being able to then notice how these short-term interior states are actually correlated with our overall neurological health, that, our brain health, our nervous system health, our diet, our exercise, etc. Because, trust, for example, we can find trust in the upper right quadrant. It looks like oxytocin. Oxytocin is like the trust drug. It's oxytocin both produces feelings of trust, right? And those feelings of trust produce more oxytocin. So it becomes sort of a self-reinforcing mechanism that we have in our brain. Think, for example, of the feeling that you have of, sort of that glow of openness and, acceptance and deep trust in the space of radical vulnerability after having sex with someone that you love. You're flooded with oxytocin in that moment. And even though you are at your most vulnerable, there's just a complete sort of unshakable trust that emerges in that space. And I sort of think we're, a little bit oxytocin depleted these days.
So you're saying we all should bone each other.
We all need to bone, brother.
That's your political message for that Biden should replace. No, but it's true. Actually, I thought a lot about it.
They will not replace us.
That's okay. All right. It doesn't matter. It's like you, me, Corey, anybody. We're all in this together. So yeah, I think that's right though, like about how to notice that, like, for example, with the pandemic, like going outside and going to stores. Now I know it's interesting to think, like, how do people get to the place of denying something even on their deathbed with COVID and being like, this can't be happening? How does people do that? Like, and why do I do that? And from a compassionate standpoint, the overwhelm and how it impacts trust, because it's a constant background noise for me. It's just like, I'm doing everything. I'm wearing my mask. I don't go out very often. If I do, it's like tactical, but that's like an eroding thing, right? This exterior of like constantly, I can't trust like I normally would. Very common environments that I like previously, it would be like, that's not part of my nervous system. And so like that is constantly buzzing for many of us. And then you could just add up in this year, like how many things are stressing people constantly that wear on, increase cortisol and things like that and interrupt those brain chemicals. Very much true. And I want to give one fun example of something that boosted my brain chemistry last week. And I think actually it's fun for Integral. If you haven't seen, you can probably just Google heavy metal preacher. I posted it on my Facebook thing. It is such a gift of 2020, but an evangelical preacher preaching, and then some guy laid over the best heavy metal track to it, and it was like a match made in heaven. It is so perfect.
Yeah,
I've watched it like 50 times. Every time I do, the little brain, the chemicals in my brain just like, I need this. I need heavy metal preacher right now. And it's also interesting to analyze it from an integral perspective because it is fascinating. But anyways,
I fell in love with a new TV show that had a very similar effect on me. Ted Lasso. If you haven't watched Ted Lasso on Apple TV,
the second person,
watch it. I mean, your heart feels better after watching that show. It's an amazing.
We need these things. So I think this is a good point, and also points to practice. Like one, acknowledging the exterior is that like it seems like the majority of us are under additional pressure that interrupts the chemistry of the body, the nervous system. And if we can find ways to help balance that out where we can, you mentioned sex, that's definitely good. Hugs, but even that's hard, like the 20-second hug, like you do it long enough to get the chemicals flowing. But even that, think about the exteriors, it's harder now. So it's like, how many people are alone right now who are quarantining and don't get to see people? So you don't get the physical touch. You don't get all of these normal interactions that would help keep the system stable and flourishing, so it's a really difficult time. Like, so how do we find those moments,
Well, I mean, you stuck your finger right into the I mean, this is so freaking complex because you mentioned the pandemic. So like the question there is, how do you unfold your trust, right? Because there's a lot of, it feels like that this is, again, been sort of politicized and polarized into two camps. There's the camp who are largely among the left, who trust institutions, who are telling us sort of best practices in order to deal with the pandemic. Mask up, socially distance, spend as much time home as you possibly can. Don't go into public if you don't have to. Don't get too close to people, etc. So a lot of people among the left, myself included, place a higher degree of trust in those prescriptions than in other people's prescriptions. On the other side of the divide, however, what they're feeling is, oh, you're telling me not to trust my neighbors. You're telling me that when I go outside, I should cross the street if someone is walking down the sidewalk.
Yeah, it's a very odd request. And when we have to recognize the demand of that, so that's why I said earlier, a compassionate view here doesn't mean I'm still not tolerant, in a certain way. I'm just no, this is too serious. And we've seen our society respond in better ways to crises in the past too. So it's not like the request is like abnormal or totally out of unprecedented, but there's gotta be compassion too of like, yeah, that's hard for people. I just kind of like today thought, I was like, you know what? It's official. Like humanity's just in over its head, as Robert Keegan's book says. Like that's just part of it. Like I've spent so much time being angry and mad that people aren't doing the taking precautions like they should, and like seeing the numbers skyrocket. But it's like, what other conclusion can we make except for humanity is in over its head, like developmentally speaking? And it's just a fact statement. It's not an excuse. It's not a tolerance. It's just like, that's how it is. But connected to the trust issue, it's like, yeah, I get it. People, like when I think like of some of the, like my ability to do this, one, like my disposition of being an introvert and a recluse, but also like all the time I've cultivated meditating and doing shadow work and everything like that has built up. Like I did a month-long solitary retreat once. So it's like, I have some capacity built up to be able to handle this. But like, if I didn't have all those things, I'm like, who knows? Could I tolerate it? Would I give in even though I knew better? So again, this is just a compassionate observation that like it is hard, and this all relates to trust.
Yep. Well, there's a funny meme that's being circulated right now from the right wing that I thought was funny and actually had some partial truth to it, which was it showed two pictures, and on the top picture it said something like mainstream media watchers or something like that, and it was people in like hazmat suits and masks and totally distant from each other, and underneath it says conspiracy theorists, and it's a family at like a Christmas dinner just enjoying themselves. And the funny thing being, usually you'd expect the conspiracy theorist to be the one walking around with masks and
right.
Now, I look at that meme, I'm like, haha, that's funny, it's kind of clever. And if you want to have all of those same people at your holiday table next Christmas and the Christmas after that and the Christmas after that, maybe we spend one Christmas in hazmat suits and masks.
This is why we've got to like emphasize the facts of like the upper right quadrant, kind of stuff. Yeah.
But when it lands on the level of trust, I mean, again, it's like, you see these stories of like, I'm introducing my baby to, my parents through, plexiglass. And it's just like, there's a heartbreak that comes with that. And I think the conservatives are particularly tuned into that heartbreak. And it is fucking heartbreaking. No,
it absolutely goes with the territory. There's no way, because as humans, this is just how we're wired, to connect and to touch, to be together. And so like, there's just a cost. And now, like you and I've said, like we say it's well worth the cost. We have ability to, what is a delayed gratification kind of thing, like to know that like, no, I can invest a year for the rest of the future. It's like we can tolerate that and handle that, but I know a lot of people can't. So it doesn't mean that we don't do everything we can to get people on board and to empower them. But in this whole conversation of trust, there's a lot of systems that aren't working and a lot of distrust that makes it even harder to get people on board. If it was just like one problem and everything else was freaking amazing, maybe people could like, okay, I can get on it. But there's so many things that aren't amazing. That's just like one thing after another. And I think people just lose their steam to stay here. And this relates to that trust.
Right. Well, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say like one other thing came up for me is like, just in general is like, there's got to be an emphasis for me on baseline needs, like on recognition. And I say that from an integral, somebody who's, integral, identifies as integral and, progressive, that like, even though I can see and value a lot of needs that are, kind of a Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing, like higher than baseline needs, we need to make sure that baseline needs are rock solid. And that is what we haven't had for a long time. And so some of the conversation we're talking about here is talking about baseline needs. So this is why, for example, right now, I'm not, as a person who voted for Joe Biden, I'm not so interested in the moment of criticizing whatever he's doing. I'll do that later. I'm just like, man, we haven't had baseline needs for a while, that I just want baseline needs. We can't have baseline needs when in a pandemic. It's really hard. Like we're trying to operate. It's an emergency situation. So part of trust for me is like, if we don't have baseline needs met, the less that those are met, the harder it's going to be, period, just for trust and anything else.
Right. No, it's all great points. And of course, if we're talking about sort of trust from a chemical perspective, in terms of oxytocin, we should also talk about fear. Fear is, obviously it's antitrust. Fear lives in your amygdala. It releases both cortisol and glutamate into your system, which are both stress hormones. And both of these are very debilitating. They erode trust. They erode human bonding. So you end up feeling less connected to other people around you, even the people in your life who are your loved ones. And over time, the effects of fear and stress on the brain, it's terrible. I mean, it's terrible. It actually causes atrophy in, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the frontal lobe. So basically what it does is, being suspended in fear and stress for so long, it makes you dumber. It makes you less empathetic. It makes you less trusting, and it makes you far more easy to manipulate. Right? Now, we have to start looking at what these stressors are, because it could be something like, for example, we've been living in fear for a year now, right? No matter what side of the divide you're on, this is generating fear. right? If you're a liberal, you're more afraid of your neighbors and the people walking down the street in your direction. If you're a conservative, you're more afraid of this sort of top-down institutional, what they perceive as authoritarianism that's stripping us of our freedoms. Either way, it's generating fear.
Yep.
And that's really, and all of that, I just want to point out, all of that gets exacerbated when we live in a society that has certain habits that are just so ingrained in our society. So in our society, in America, we know that we have a terrible sugar addiction, right? The majority of people in this country overdose, myself included. This is I've got huge shadow issues in this. This is my work in a lot of ways. I have a sugar addiction, and I notice the physiological effects that having too much sugar will have on me for like a week, right? It'll affect my interior states. It'll make me more edgy, more prone to sort of, getting angry. My fuse gets shorter, right? Yeah. So I have to actually bring some mindfulness to this because I can see how this is affecting me personally. When you extrapolate that out to an entire society that's struggling with sugar intake, that's struggling with diabetes, that's struggling with obesity, right? And then you lay all these stressors on top of that.
Yeah, it makes a serious breaking point.
Huge breaking point. And it keeps people trapped. And I think, Ryan, this is why we have seen a measurable decrease of empathy, like almost 50% in 30 years.
Yeah, well, it's
40 years.
It's a pretty easy thing to reflect on for all of us. It's just like what's your best day of empathy? Is it when you're like freshly, good night's sleep, happy, no stress, or is it that day when like no sleep, everything is going wrong in your day? Like, it's just common. It's just like, we're going to be on our best when things are going well and we're resourced.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and notice again, just the 4 quadrant. I mean, how quickly it cycles through the 4 quadrants, right? So in the upper right, I have too much sugar one night because I'm stoned and I have munchies and I eat too much candy, right? The next day, I wake up and I'm groggy in my upper left and I'm just kind of cranky and grumpy. So I have an interaction with my wife and maybe, I say something unskillful and then that creates tension between us, which then affects our family unit in the lower right and how we through the world together. So all of this, just like, none of this is isolated to just one. Again, it's what makes it a wicked problem. Something happens in this quadrant, it immediately changes all of the other factors and all of the other quadrants. And it just cascades. Yeah. Which is what makes intervention so difficult.
Yeah. Well, I've done so much better with the sugar thing, but that's always been my struggle. So like I've got a hold on it for the most part, but I feel like I'd be your bad addiction partner. Cause like you said all that thing and I just glossed over all of your pain and suffering. I'm like, but what was it? What did you eat there the other night? Can you describe it for me, Corey?
Yep. I ate half a freaking Dairy Queen ice cream cake.
Oh, Dairy Queen. I haven't had Dairy Queen forever. See, this is why we're not going to help each other in that department. It's a good thing we don't live in the same city.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. Yep. So many stressors. I think that's the point. Just so max amount of stressors all at one time makes the practice of trust, very, very difficult. And it's happening across
the important thing to remember too is that there are interventions here, right? I mean, you can lower your sugar intake. It's difficult because they're habits. It's hard as hell to change a habit, right? But it can be done. You can exercise more. It's hard as hell to get that started, right? It can be feel like you're just like trying to run through a wall. But it can be done. You can find that discipline and you can do it. So there are interventions along with every single one of these.
Yes.
That's important for us to track. So now let's kind of shift over to the lower left issues. And obviously the lower left is, in the I thou relationship, God is the hyphen. Well, in the I thou relationship, trust is the hyphen as well.
Right.
So much of this, the conversation of trust lands directly in the lower left quadrant. And I think that there are ways to enact this sort of on a personal level, on an individual level. Like, how can we be more available to each other? How can we take do a better job taking each other's perspective, inhabiting each other's views, etc. But I think there's also some really important, organizational factors that we could talk about as well. I've got a small list if you want me to share it.
Sure.
So I think that, when it comes to trying to fix the language here is going to be a little bit difficult because some of this is going to sound like lower right, but I'm framing it as lower left because all of this begins with a shared intention on an organizational level, right? And then it gets executed in the lower right and elsewhere. But, I think that one of the most important things to begin with is, you mentioned earlier, making sure that the institutions that you're demanding people have more trust in, that you need to make sure that those institutions are actually delivering real benefit to people, real benefit. And not only that, you are adequately communicating that benefit to people, because we are really, really good at being sort of talked out of our own best interests. Which is something we see happening politically on both sides of the divide all the time. So being able to clearly communicate the benefit of this institution, how it serves you, how it makes your life better, more convenient, right? Gives you more mobility, more opportunity, et cetera. The more we can do that and sort of, start creating on a narrative level, as well as an evidence-based level, more justification for these institutions, the better it's going to be. The second one is to simply develop leaders who are capable of working for the greater good and not just for themselves. And this one is really, really difficult because our entire sphere of politics is based on, this illusion of social benevolence, which is actually sort of a mask for your own kind of, desire to seek and secure power. So how do you actually know when a leader is coming from an authentic place? How do you know when a leader is not just another corporate lobbyist, but is an actual civil servant, for example? I don't know if I have an algorithm that makes it easy to detect, but simply asking the question, right? What are the motivations here? Are we looking for, ways to sort of perpetuate political power for, a single party, for example? And therefore these leaders are conforming themselves and, kind of strategizing and really making themselves inauthentic in order to get very particular, tactical goals of permanent power, for example. How do you actually discern that? There's a lot of people on the left who look at someone like Obama and being like, well, here's a great example of someone who I feel like was coming from a greater good. But I can also understand the plurality of people who disagree with that. And no, Obama was, kind of more like other presidents than not. I don't know how much I agree with that view, but I understand it because it's a spectrum, right?
Ken, in that same chapter I mentioned earlier, Ken talks about altitude and aptitude amongst leaders in the we space, because he mentions leaders in the we space just like you're doing now. So if we focus only on aptitude, we miss something. So obviously Integral is always wanting to bring in the combination of altitude and aptitude as far as assessing leaders.
100%. Yeah. Ken's so smart.
He's done a few things. Yeah, put a few things together.
He's said a few smart things in the past.
That's right.
So number 3 is a fairly obvious one, but again, one of those things that's a little bit easier said than done. Increasing accountability and transparency in our institutions. So it's one thing for an institution to deliver you benefit and to be able to, properly communicate to you how you're benefiting from this institution existing in the first place. But when it comes to actually then, deepening that trust in the institution, accountability and transparency are huge. I mean, no wonder our nation, our culture has become as cynical as it has when, for example, after the 2008 economic crash, no one was held accountable. No one was held accountable. There was no accountability to be found. And then just a couple years later, when all of these leaks come out about, how many people are offshoring their wealth and keeping it in the Cayman Islands and all this obviously incredibly corrupt shit that's happening in the highest echelons of power, and there's zero accountability for it, right? Zero accountability. That is going to erode trust. So being able to find ways to enforce accountability and transparency, I'm not a big fan of transparency. It sounds funny to say. I'm more a fan of translucency. I'm fully aware that it's not, ideas of 100% transparency are not always appropriate. But I am for making things as reasonably translucent as you possibly can, while still sort of preserving the, inertia of the institution itself. There's some things that, are too wonky maybe, or are too morally complex. I think of things like drone warfare, Drone warfare is it's easy to sort of come at this from like a very black or white view, like oh, I'm anti-drone warfare because civilians are killed and there's no accountability, versus oh, I love drone warfare because we shouldn't be putting American boots in the ground if we don't have to, and risking our own soldiers' lives, and we need military interventions in the world still, because we don't live in this world where everyone is turquoise and gets along just fine. There's some real evils in the world, and it's, you know, sort of you know, first world nations have an obligation to work together to stem out that evil whenever they can, and unfortunately sometimes it means dropping bombs. So, you know, I'm aware of the challenges here, and that things aren't always black and white, but creating as much accountability and as much transparency as possible is always...
Yeah, it's great.
Yep.
That's great. I think it directly relates to trust.
Yep. Number 4, and I think this is critical, actually, because this is actually an example of, I want you to trust me, so therefore I have to trust you. And one of the ways that an organization can do that is to actually crowdsource these sorts of community problems and challenges among the people, and actually just say, hey, can you help me solve this problem? Can you help us solve this problem? Right. And I think that what this does is it not only creates this sort of, you know, two-way highway of trust and communication, but it actually sort of invites this groundswell of what we might call genius, right? Just sort of the genius that's shared in any sort of collective population, which is very different than things like mob rules and sort of, you know, we all know that when you put a bunch of human beings together into a big group, we kind of turn into dumb animals. We know that, but there's also a wisdom, you know, Alan Watkins has written a lot about this in Crowdocracy. You know, he gives the example of people who guess the number of gumdrops that are in a barrel. No individual gets anywhere right, but when you average all of the answers from all the individuals, it's almost always dead on.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Really, really close to dead on. So there is this sort of emergent wisdom among a population that can be harnessed, right, in order to not only rebuild trust, but to solve problems in so doing. So I think that there's a lot of, you know, great ideas around this with like community policing, for example. That's a great way for police forces to start rebuilding trust in their own communities. Just as one example.
That's great.
Yeah. Number 5, strengthening social inclusion. What's funny about this is this sounds a lot like the woke project. But of course, the woke project, what makes them as pathological as they often are, is that they are actually not strengthening social inclusion. They are creating exclusive sort of circles of belief and of values and of views, and anyone who does not share or participate in those values and views are pushed out, are pushed into the margins. So this is obviously, you know, wokeism is a very, very unhealthy version of pushing for strong social inclusion. What we actually need here is a return to the healthy green project, right? There's something about, you know, green in and of itself, when it's healthy, is vibrant and it's beautiful. And God, does our world need more of it right now, especially when it comes to rebuilding these bridges and, you know, sort of finding our trust in each other again. And then the last one is simply establishing real commitment. And that's, you know, that's a tough one too, because it's always easier to say things than it is to do things, right? But saying things is always the first step. And so institutions, our media institutions, our governing institutions, etc., need to acknowledge that there's a problem here. CNN needs to come out and say, hey, we acknowledge that 40% of the country thinks we are lying with every word that comes out of our mouth. We need to acknowledge this, and we need to accept this as a real challenge, and we need to rehabilitate ourselves and our relationship, right? If we ever want to be seen as a credible, legitimate news organization worth trusting.
Yeah.
It's you know, you really have to be able to name the problem,
right?
You know, and I feel I'm glad for the fact that, again, at least by appearances, we'll see if the walk follows the talk, but by appearances, Joe Biden is taking that problem seriously. He's recognizing that there is a massive problem of trust and solidarity in this country. And he's trying to give, you know, I mean, we can be political opponents without being enemies, just as like, hey, how's this for a baseline? You know, like a basic baseline.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. Baseline needs is we got to. I mean, it's just like a kind of, I don't know, it feels like a common sense kind of thing a little bit, but about like, you just imagine this personal relationship of like you and a group of friends. It's just like, you can't get anything done if you're emphasizing blaming the whole time. And now that there's a balance there. It's like, we're not talking about getting rid of accountability, but right now I feel like there's a lot of fear in letting go into like a little bit of trust too. That's what it feels like, because it's sort of just like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff really messed up and that's really painful right now. But like, for me, there's been a breath of fresh air to just hear. I want to hear somebody say like, listen, let's get together. Let's make something happen. All right. I want to hear some positive framing, not in a naive way, but it's just like, I think like we were talking earlier, like almost like a fundamental evolutionary need. If we don't have some of that like warmth of connection, regardless of like what level it is, even if it's like sort of baseline sociocentric connection, with each other, it's just like, well, good luck in solving a problem, because otherwise we're going to be like pissed off siblings and be like, no, you started it. It's like, I get it. Like, I'm not equalizing everything at all, but just like, gosh, at a certain point we need to come together a little bit. And that might be like the best version of that, like a green inclusivity. That's a healthy inclusivity, but yeah.
Yeah, all well said. And of course, all these prescriptions I just described are all sort of many to many solutions in the lower left.
Right.
We could also spend an entire show talking about one-to-one solutions in the lower left. And you've already mentioned a ton of that. I mean, this is where things like, just coming at any interaction in good faith. That's one way we can generate more trust in the lower left, by seeking to get beneath each other's views where we're almost certainly going to disagree, and instead reconnecting along our shared values. That is a lower left quadrant one-to-one strategy that people can use in every interaction they have, whether online or face-to-face. So there's any number of these things that we can do with each other, both one-to-one and as sort of on an organizational level, that's going to generate in the long term more trust within that lower left space between us. And when that happens, I think that we'll feel it, right? We'll feel it in our relationships with each other. We'll feel it in our relationships to the world. We'll feel like there's this closing of a gap, right? We'll feel like there's this less temptation to jump to conclusions about each other's views and what that means about them morally, or in terms of their intelligence, or, what have you. Because people hold on to views that are sometimes 2 or 3 full stages behind where the rest of their sort of the center of gravity of their development is at. Because views are usually the very last thing that we push through these new lenses that we develop for ourselves as we continue to grow up and as we continue to wake up and clean up. Views tend to come last. And it takes a lot of work to reevaluate all of these presuppositions that you've been walking around with. And it also takes a lot of humility as well. And it takes a lot of trust that you can talk with someone who holds an opposing viewpoint of your own, to your own, who can inform your viewpoint and maybe even dislodge you from some faulty reasoning. And that takes humility in the space of human interaction.
Yeah, humility is going to be probably a big antidote that we're going to have to swallow one way or another to get through all this. Yep. I also want to share some of these practices here since I'm going to be having to leave in a bit.
Yeah, well, we're going right into the upper left, baby. So why don't you take it over?
Well, just real quick, I don't know if you want to respond to a comment in YouTube. I assume it's for you, but really the person just said dude rather than one of our names. So we both identify as dudes. So I'm not sure which dude you were talking about there.
Sounds like it's great in theory, but it seems like it's been developed indoors without engagement with any of the ideas being shared. I'm honestly not too sure how to respond to that because, obviously everything I'm sharing comes from a combination of my own personal experience, what has worked for me in various conversations with people. It's come through a lot of research in terms of how are some of the smartest minds, or at least minds that I recognize as being smarter than myself. How are they approaching this problem from a systemic point of view, from an organizational point of view? So I'm basically just trying to compile some of these interventions and kind of putting them all in one space without saying any one of these is going to be the magic bullet to fix anything.
Yeah. Well, and so the nature of this show, obviously, so this is part of the Integral Life Network, and obviously Integral is very theoretically oriented.
Right.
And so that's just natural. And there's always that classic dichotomy of researchers and clinicians. And, like saying, for example, in psychology, and that's always going to be true. That's not just like there's a dichotomy or either or, but there's a spectrum of like, where does somebody operate? And it's all needed. Like an integral, it's like all included. It's not a picking of one or the other. So like theory is really helpful. And the more in the trenches you are, the less you are in the theory and being able to take a look back to get perspective. But the more hands are you are, and then the more you can inform the people who are taking perspectives and you work together. So like something being theoretical is not in and of itself negative. And I would disagree with the like being somehow detached from life, because for example, in your situation, you talk to a lot of people here at Integral Life who are in the thick of things as well, in addition to your own lived experience. Mm-hmm. And ironically, the indoors is an interesting thing. It's like most everything these days is happening indoors, separated. So it's like, this is kind of like what the space we're living in. But so, and it's always a good starting point too. It's like, this is what we offer here. A lot of times as a starting point, it's like, I was always asked is like, was nothing useful in that? Was it all batshit crazy? Or was there some useful things that then we all can take and continue molding and working with? That's the idea here that we're talking. We're never prescribing, like you say prescription, but it's just like, this is a starting point. Let's see where it goes. What do you think about this? And it would be surprising to me if we were just like, wow, nothing of what you just said was relevant at all. So I don't know. We're always explaining like the spirit in which we're sharing here. But
well, and I guess my question, would be for anyone who comes in with a comment like that, like, are you making the comment in good faith?
Yeah, that's always a good thing, right?
You are awesome. I mean, and I'm going to assume that you were, and that's why we chose to respond to it. I'm assuming it's a good faith comment, but I would ask, a follow-up question to maybe ask yourself is, are you asking this question because you're coming into this conversation already from a space of mistrust? Like, we're just two, dudes with faces on YouTube right now, right? And I don't trust the majority of people that I find on YouTube. Yep. So there's sort of this automatic assumption of like, oh, I'm going to be a little bit cautiously.
Yeah. Well, and the sign here would be what can I offer creatively? If I'm criticizing and deconstructing something, I one of two things. I need to offer something creative to show my good faith, right? To show that I'm interested in a solution and that I feel like I have something here to offer, which requires vulnerability because I have to share mine and be subjected to the same sort of criticism, or I have to be vulnerable and humble and say like, listen, what you're saying doesn't make sense to me. I think it's harmful or whatever. And I have no idea.
Right.
So if you don't do either of those two things, your good faith is in question for me, just in general. Like, and I hold that standard to myself too in these contexts of integral. So that's the thing. It's like, and not to mention again, as we said, we hold this in a spirit of like creative pondering and wondering. That's kind of what this container is for. And we try to, as far as integral goes, lean towards an embodied approach of like, let's get practical, which is what we're going to talk about now. Of like, let's talk about what we can do. Practically speaking, yes. and you really, the we stuff you already offered was great. And to me, I would just add on that simple finding, like we talked about we spaces, finding a we that you can be a part of that feels really good and nourishing. And it feels like this year that has been a lifeline in a lot of ways, online community. So Integral Life, the new practice community that's shown up, has filled out this sense of there's a community here. There are all these shows. There's the audience, there's the forums, there's the Facebook, there's the practice community. And, for me over at Buddhist Geeks as well, we've a flourishing community over there of online training. So like that thing of being able to connect with people, even though there's still something about being in person to have that feeling of connection. That's one thing that I would recommend as a practice is find a community that you can be a part of. It's not about an echo chamber. It's about like relationship. Like, do you feel relationship there, and it might be around certain interests like integral theory or meditation or whatever it is, but like, do you feel part of something? Do you feel belonging to something? And if you can't answer that question, that would be something I would invite you to sit with is like, where are you? Because we're all belonging. We're part of a we as well. We're not only a we, but we are a we. And if you want to avoid that question of like, I don't want to talk about belonging, then that's going to relate to trust.
Yep.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yep, 100%. And for my part, I would never ask someone to trust that I'm getting it all right.
Oh yeah.
What I do ask is that people
For
trust
sure.
that I'm doing my best to get it right.
Yeah,
I'm not always
that's
going to
right.
be right, but I'm always going to do my best to get it right. And
Well,
there's a really important difference there.
Oh, and that happens in demonstration. So it's like, can we demonstrate the good faith of like saying like, I really care. And again, this relates to vulnerability. Like I care and I'm going to show up and I'm going to talk about these issues and also say like, oh, certainly gonna be partial. That's the whole thing about integral, partial, but true. You know, it's like, we're going to be partial automatically. And that's why we do a we conversation, because like you said, with the gumballs, it's kind of like a neat example of like, put enough together, maybe we're gonna figure some things out, you know?
That's right. That's
so
right.
yeah, a few things I wanted to share, like just practice before we get to the end of the show today. Like in the upper left, I do think that community thing is huge, especially this year. That has been for me like a standout, that has been really, really important. Just being part of a community that's healthy and nourishing and gives a sense of belonging. But in terms of individual practice, in terms of getting resourced, like we talked about earlier, anything that gives in a healthy way the chemicals in the body, you know, a good brain chemistry is great. I'm not an expert on that per se, but there's a lot of expertise out there about how to do that kind of thing. But in terms of being resourced, like, you know, there's plenty of research on just like standard, it's kind of like what's meditation, but like meditation that can help regulate the nervous system, that can help change blood pressure, that can do the brain chemistry thing. So you need to research which meditation practices would be best. There's a lot of scientific journals out there that would talk about which meditation they studied, but there's a lot of options and there's a lot of people to work with around that. But just doing some sort of meditation can be grounding. Other specific meditations, you know, like earth breathing, embodiment practices that help you get down in the body rather than like pulling up, you know, and tensing. Like, how can we release and feel grounding? If we can get outside and feel the earth, touch the earth, very simple things. There's a lot of practices here, big traditions, but I'm just mentioning it in like basic way. Find one of these things that can help do that. Yep. A couple practices beyond that really get into like trust is doing Zen noting, like we call it over at Buddhist Geeks, Zen noting, would be as blank there is. So it kind of feels similar to like big mind stuff, but it's slightly different. And so as trust, there is uncertainty. You know, like I'm going to try to inhabit trust. As trust, there's hope. So you can do this practice where you note as trust and you're trying to inhabit trust, or just see what comes up and you know what comes up. This helps get you into a real organic relationship, a kind of real time. Where am I at with trust right now?
There's some big mind overlap with that. Let me speak.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's very much very similar. But it's a very simple format because when you say there is, you can just use one or two words. Right. And so it makes it a little tight. And then, gosh dang it, there's one other one.
I can mention a few while you find it. I found it was interesting that the American Psychological Association recommends loving kindness meditation.
Oh, yeah.
Which actually to me
any heartful practice.
Yep, absolutely. Which to me shows how much of this sort of let's just call it higher consciousness has trickled down into society over the last 20 years. You didn't see a lot of mentions of loving kindness meditation or really any meditations in the journals 20, 25 years ago. So I see that as really, really encouraging. Gratitude practice is one that Ken really leads with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, gratitude. Thank you for bringing those up. Gratitude and like heartfulness-based practices, meta practices. Those could be like, for me, almost in that like foundational things, like a standard kind of like mindfulness, regulation practice, grounding practices, earth-based practices, heartfulness.
Each of them kind of gets at a different facet. Like you can do formless meditation, and that's going to give you a certain sort of resiliency and anti-fragility and all that you can bring to all the rest of your experiences. But then you have these like sort of focused practice, these form-based practices, like a a gratitude practice, or, Ken also leads with forgiveness practice.
Yeah. And here the invitation for me, like if I, as a standard kind of default invitation, is to like feel out what is most useful in this moment. And of course, community, mentors and teachers can be really helpful for that, which also helps with everything we're talking about here because there's relationship. But these are good default recommendations. Another one here that's really interesting that I was just thinking about, although I don't know that I've tried this version out, but there's a format called binary noting in social meditation that we use, where you note a dichotomy of something, and moment to moment, you're going to notate which of them are arising. And it could be trust or no trust. For example, I go back and forth, or some of the other ones we've used before, lacking or not lacking. And it's just like moment to moment how I feel. It's like there's trust, no trust, trust, no trust, and you just know that again, it's shining light on what's happening with trust in us moment to moment. And that often we oscillate, so that's another way of getting into trust specifically. And then one last thing, this is from Michael Taft. He came up with some meta-systematic koans that are would be in the realm of metadharma, integral dharma, and I think they're really neat and relate to this. We have it in our metadharma guide, but the way they're phrased is really interesting. They're meant to provoke, but you just ask them kind of like a koan. What do I believe will save me this time? What is the truth that is always true? And you just ask the question and see what arises, and it's going to get at trust here. I'm 100% certain that, and see what comes up. These are some of these koans here. So this is a spectrum, like in working with trust. On one end, it's just resourcefulness, so that trust can be easier, that it can happen, because if it's something that we need to survive as humans, then how can we support that? Then you go more and more into trust itself and kind of getting into the content where it's going to stir things up a little bit, start shining light, turning subject into object, right? Which is really important, as you mentioned. So there are a lot of things I think you can work with. If I had to recommend base things, it's community, and then some of those foundational meditations like grounding and embodiment and heartfulness. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and that's, I think what we're seeing is, just to talk about Ken's multi-layered cake again.
Yeah.
We've got a whole upper left quadrant cake here in terms of strategies to deal with this.
Yep.
And I think that, one of the things that's probably fairly self-evident is that practices that increase empathy are also going to increase trust.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, there is no trust without empathy. Empathy is the space within which your trust can emerge in the first place.
Yeah.
There's some common empathy building practices that are not, they don't feel like homework. They're actually enjoyable. It's things that you want to do. Reading fiction is one of the best ways. We've actually studied this has a small but a measurable impact on increasing empathy simply by reading fiction, right? Because this is putting you into alternate perspectives, dealing with alternate problems and challenges, and you're sort of, embodying someone else's point of view as they take you through this story and through this narrative, and you're applying it to your own life and your own thinking. So all of that can be very sort of expanding. And again, it's fun. People love reading fiction.
Yeah.
So there's stuff like this. And I think that there's some intellectual pieces here as well. So simply studying integral, I think, is going to help you, right, with these challenges. Simply having the language to discern and identify when these things are popping up in your experience, and knowing sort of what shape they're taking and how they're affecting sort of all these other
having more reference points.
Yeah. So a few episodes ago, I came up with this map around the issue of trust, and I just want to post it one more time for people because I think it's relevant to this episode. And this to me is an example of an intellectual frame that we can use to kind of track our own experience. So this is using both sort of integral thinking, but also a particular injunction known as polarity thinking. In order to, let me just sort of back up. The basic premise of polarity thinking is to first identify what the real polarities are that you're working with. And it's a real polarity if both of them are either positive or sort of neutral. So for example, Ryan, you were talking about this toggling practice, trusting, trusting, for example. That's one version of a practice. A polarity version is actually saying, okay, well, not trusting is, I can't find any positive qualities to not trusting.
Yep.
So that doesn't seem to be a polarity as much as what I came up with was trust and verify, right? Both of which can lapse into, particular negatives. So on the positive side of trust, there is, as we talked about, there's a basic assumption of good faith. There's an awareness of basic journalistic standards, how stories are written in the first place. There's an appreciation for fourth estate political roles played by things like mainstream media. And then there's a basic premise that you start with, that reality is knowable, right? Like I can approach these things. The reality is knowable, it's understandable. And if I put in the work, I can trust that I will have a better understanding of the world around me. On the flip side of that, trust polarity is the verification polarity, which looks a lot like critical thinking. There's an assumption, there's a good faith that comes with trust, but there's also an assumption of unavoidable implicit bias that exists in all sources, right? The question is how cynical are you being about where that bias is coming from? Do you think it's some top-down Illuminati conspiracy, or do you think it's, for example, basic profit motives in the lower right quadrant, all of which tend to be very short-sighted, short-term, etc. There's an intentional seeking out of sources that are high factual, low bias. There's seeking out alternative perspectives that help eliminate bias when you find it, and so forth. And then for each of these, both on the trust and the verification, there's downsides. If you have too much trust but not enough critical thinking, it results in something like naivety, where you have this, for example, an assumption that all media outlets are always telling the truth and they always have our best interests at heart. That's a bit of a straw man. I don't think I've ever known a single person who believes that, but just to kind of straw man that point. There's often a refusal to falsify sources that come from different viewpoints than your own. So this is what happens when we have too much trust, not enough critical thinking. And then there's the negative polarity of having too much critical thinking and not enough trust, which I think is the larger problem that we're dealing with in this society right now. This looks like cynicism. And again, it comes from an overemphasis on critical thinking and a total absence of trust. There's an assumption that all media outlets have only malicious interests in heart. They're only trying to manipulate and dominate us. Those are sort of narrative conclusions that come out of this space of cynicism. There's a whole list there. You guys can look at, pause the video, check out. But I think that this is useful because it gives us this mental scaffolding, these basic guardrails to recognize, oh, okay, I'm kind of falling a little bit too far in this direction. I'm going to course correct. Okay, now I'm going a little far in this direction. The idea is to bring these polarities into integration with each other, to have a healthy version of trust, a healthy version of critical thinking, and you're bringing those together in order to regenerate trust, again, between each other, in institutions, in God, in evolution, and so forth.
Yeah. And this also ties back into earlier when I mentioned David Chapman's meaningless and incomplete stances, eternalism and nihilism shows up right there. It's like complete trust without question, or can't trust anything. And the point here, like, especially of how like we practice integral Dharma over Buddhist geeks and how I teach it, is that like you have to like see these in your lived experience. And so like if, for example, we have tendencies, which we all do, of oscillating, like we have to have a question, like a complete stance would be, as you said, to be able to hold both of these. And I think that is true, that like more and more they can be held simultaneously, but also the reality isn't quite so perfect. And so it's really important for us to show when we oscillate. And that's why, like earlier when I mentioned the binary practice, what that kind of practice does is shows how we oscillate ourselves between these in real time directly. So we use that kind of map there to show like, okay, this makes sense. I see how this really plays out. Now in practice, let's see if I can loosen myself up from this, because if I can see that I'm buying into eternalism or nihilism or naive trust or cynical verification, I'll see that play out in real time. And if I can see it more and more, then I am disembedding from it. Right. And so we have to have a practical tool to do that. So something like binary noting is great. And
it fits right into this map, because after that,
it's perfect. It's kind of perfect how we tie it together, because
from the diagonals. That's what you're toggling, is the diagonals. Like you're doing trust versus cynicism is what you're kind of toggling in that moment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it was nice to bring that in there. The one thing I mentioned too is, like, even though we talked about upper left, I was just realizing it's a good point to make here that, for example, again, over at Buddhist Geeks, we use social meditation a lot because it's a really good format to do online, but it's just good in general because it's so odd that we haven't ever done that before. Like usually it's like, oh, we're all meditating together, but everybody's having just their own little individual experience and we're not practicing together. But how do you do that in an integral way? You know, well, for example, if we do a social noting practice, like I just mentioned, like trust, no trust, we just take turns. So everybody has their own individual experience, but we are practicing together. We are witnessing and hearing each other, yet we're not getting into the content of it. So you don't have to get in this massive like debriefing there. So practicing together, there is a social lower left experience when we do social meditation, even though there's also an upper left experience that's unfolding. And tonight, actually, this week, we kind of pioneered a new practice recently called Zen Noting Relay, where we're going to do it actually as a social practice where, for example, Corey, you might start off with a there is note, you know, and it might be there is curiosity. I take your note like a baton as curiosity, there is, and I look at my experience. And whatever I know, there is, as curiosity, there is not knowing. The next person as not knowing, there is. And you create this relay, which makes it even more a social practice. But I realize it really does balance a lot of things, individual, collective, it's operating subject, object. It's quite an interesting integral practice.
It's contemplative improv.
Yeah, it is really kind of like that. And we have a reset button though in there. So like there's a masculine and feminine thing where a person can reset the whole chain at any moment. Right. Anyways, I think there's a lot that we can cultivate, a lot that's being innovated this year. If we look around too, that gives me hope. Like when we look, the integral community, practice community emerged. Interesting. Yep. Emerged now. That didn't exist. And now it's here. Wonderful. Right. You know, so
that's beautiful.
These are things to give hope.
Well, Ryan, this has been an awesome show. I know you got to bounce off.
Yeah.
You know, I want to just put a final bow on the conversation and just say that, you know, my experience is that trust is curative. That trust is actually more than anything else what allows us to confront with and deal with our various shadow issues. You know, for example, doing these shows. When I started doing these shows, it rubbed against every fear, anxiety, uncertainty, insecurity that I had. Public speaking was like, you know, the major threat in my life. And especially like having to be held accountable to such high standards as integral, it scared the shit out of me. But through these conversations with people like you, Ryan, who I trust implicitly and explicitly, right? There is just a baseline of trust that I feel with you, that I feel with Ken, that I feel with Dr. Keith Witt, that I feel with the people that I'm doing these shows with, that has actually allowed me to confront and deal with and metabolize these shadow issues from episode to episode to episode, to the point where now, you know, this many years in, like I feel more confident doing these shows than I ever felt before. And it comes from that space of trust. It comes from that hyphen in the I-thou relationship that's shared between you and I and, you know, and others. And I'm deeply grateful for that.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, this has been great, man. I'm glad we were able to surf this year together. And hey, this is our last one for 2020.
Holy shit.
Wow. We're going to see you all in 2021.
We'll see you next year, guys.
Yeah.
I hate that joke. It's like the worst dad joke. Everyone uses it.
Yeah, I love dad jokes.
My daughter actually has a shirt that says, I love dad jokes. I make her as often as
I need to get that one. Great.
All right, Ryan. Well, thank you so much for your time, man. As always.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for watching. And, you know, speaking of crowdsourcing solutions, let us know in the comments below what you think is going to help generate trust, more trust, both in the short term, in the long term, in the integral community and elsewhere. We want to hear your thoughts. So
that'd be lovely.
In the meantime, see you later, everyone.
See ya all.